Now, empathy, the art of stepping into the shoes of other people and looking at the world through their eyes, is a more popular concept today than at any time in the last century. You know, Barack Obama has been talking about America's empathy deficit. School children and medical students are learning empathy skills. Everyone from business gurus to the Dalai Lama have become its champions. So what's empathy all about? Why does it really matter? Well, it partly matters because empathy can improve the quality of our personal relationships. It enables us to understand other people, to communicate with them, to get on with them. Without empathy, we're emotionally tone deaf. But empathy can do something more. It can create radical social change. A lot of people think empathy is a sort of nice, soft, fluffy concept about being kind. I think the opposite. I think empathy can create a revolution. And, you know, not one of those old-fashioned revolutions of new laws or new policies or institutions, but something much more radical. A revolution of human relationships. And we urgently need this revolution, partly because, of course, we live in an age of hyper-individualism, where an overdose of simplistic self-help and free market culture have made us think that the ultimate question is, what's in it for me? And empathy is the antidote we need. But something else is going on. You know, empathy is very difficult to measure, but the best surveys show that empathy levels have dropped by nearly 50% in the United States over the last 3 decades, and the steepest decline in the last 10 years, partly due to the rise of digital culture, and this is happening in other countries as well. Now, there's good news, which is that 98% of us have the ability to empathize wired into our brains. The bad news is we're not very good at using it. So there's a question of how do we develop our empathic potential? And the first thing you need to do is to understand that there are 2 different kinds of empathy. Right? The first kind is what's called affective empathy. That's empathy as a shared or mirrored emotional response. So if you see anguish on the face of a child, and you also feel anguish, that's affective empathy. You're sharing or mirroring their emotions. Now, if you look at anguish on the face of that same child and feel a different emotion, like pity, you think, oh, the poor little thing. That's not empathy, that's what's called sympathy. Right? Sympathy is an emotional response, but one that isn't shared. It's an important distinction. But if affective empathy is a mirror, the second kind of empathy, cognitive empathy, think of it as a pair of shoes. It's about really stepping into somebody else's life, into their shoes, and looking at the world from their viewpoint. It's about understanding what's it really like to be another person. And we're really good at this, right? You walk past a homeless guy, and you don't just feel sorry for him. You know, remember, that's sympathy. You actually think, well, what's it like to sleep out rough on a cold winter's night? Or, you know, what's it like to have someone walk past you without looking you in the eye? And it really matters, this cognitive empathy, because it enables us to respond appropriately to other people's needs and feelings. And I've learned this from my own children, right? I've got twins, a boy and a girl. And before their natural empathy had developed, which normally comes in by the age of about 2, you get a situation like this, where my son, when they're about 1.5, my son was crying, would be crying, and his sister would try and comfort him with her favorite toy dog, which was a kind gesture, but like absolutely no use to him, right? Fast forward a year, when the empathy had kicked in, they were about 2.5, when my son was crying, his sister would go and comfort him with his favorite toy cat. Right? That's the cognitive leap of empathy. But beyond that, we need to think, okay, well, how do I really cultivate this as a skill? Because you can learn empathy like riding a bike or driving a car. The first thing to do, and there are 4 things, is to make the imaginative leap. And what I mean by that is to consciously try and put yourself in other people's shoes and try and make a habit of it. And someone who was really good at this was Mahatma Gandhi. And he said something just before he died called Gandhi's talisman. It's kind of like a rule of thumb, a moral principle to live by about imagination. He said this: whenever you are in doubt, or when the self is too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest man who you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him. Then you'll find your doubts and yourself melting away. Gandhi's talisman. Imagine if that talisman was on the screensaver of every banking baron, or even on your own. You know what difference it might make. But Gandhi didn't just say empathize with the poor and the marginalized. He also said empathize with your enemies, people whose views you can't stand. He was a Hindu who said, I'm a Muslim, and a Hindu, and a Christian, and a Jew. And I think we can all think about, okay, who are the sort of enemies in my life I might try and empathize with, whether it's a brother or sister you haven't spoken to for years, or a boss at work who's making your life a nightmare. So make the imaginative leap. The second thing you can do is to practice the art of empathic listening. Now, we've all been in those situations where you're arguing with your partner or your husband or your wife. You thought, oh, God, I wish they could just see things from my point of view. I wish they could just understand what I'm feeling. And what are you asking for? Empathy, of course. You want them to step into your shoes, if only for a moment. And practicing this is actually quite easy. If you're ever in those tense situations with somebody arguing with them, what you need to do is try and focus on and listen to what are their feelings and what are their needs. Even ask them what their feelings and needs are. It's amazing how it reduces the tension. But you can do even more. You can actually reflect back to them what they've just said so they understand that you understand them. There's a really great statistic, which is that in disputes between employers and employees, labor disputes, if both sides agree before they start talking to literally just repeat what the other person had said before they start talking themselves, you reach conflict resolution 50% faster. Okay? And that is amazing, and I think it works both in the workplace but also in the kitchen. But we need to take empathy out of the kitchen and onto the streets. And my third thought is that we need to develop our curiosity about strangers. One of the great barriers to empathy is that we stereotype people. We have prejudices. We judge them by what they look like, by their clothes, by their accents. And highly empathic people get beyond those stereotypes, beyond the facade. And I remember once I used to walk for years past this homeless guy where I live in Oxford in England, a guy who would be talking to himself all the time. He was kind of crazy. He would walk with no shoes in the snow. I thought I have nothing in common with this man. One day I started talking to him. Turned out his name was Alan Human, and he had actually studied philosophy at Oxford University. He was an expert on Nietzsche and Aristotle, and we developed a great friendship based on our mutual interest in moral philosophy and pepperoni pizza. Right? And it just shows how extraordinary the world around us is, that empathy can help us get beyond those stereotypes, being curious about strangers. You can practice it by going, for example, to a human library event, which is a movement that began in Denmark about 10 years ago. It's now spread to about 20 countries. And when you go to a human library, what you do is you go along, and instead of borrowing a book, you borrow a person for conversation. And it could be a Muslim teenager, or an unhappy investment banker, or a political refugee. But apart from that, you can just cultivate curiosity about strangers in everyday life. I think a great empathic prescription is to have a conversation with a stranger at least once a week and get beyond the superficial talk about the weather and the football and talk about the stuff that really matters in life. Now, there's a final way of cultivating empathy, which is to support mass empathic movements. Because empathy isn't just about individuals. It can occur on a collective scale and change history. And an organization that really inspires me is called the Parents Circle. It operates in Israel and Palestine. And they have these fantastic empathy-building projects on a great scale. One of them was called the Hello Peace telephone line. Any Israeli could phone a free phone telephone number on billboards around the country. They could phone this number and they were put through to a Palestinian stranger. And they could talk to them about anything for up to half an hour. Palestinians could call Israelis, and the same thing could happen. Talk to them for half an hour. In its first 5 years of operation, the Hello Peace phone line had over 1 million telephone calls on it. So just imagine if we created a similar telephone line here in the Netherlands, or using Skype, between rich and poor, or between climate change activists and climate change skeptics. Imagine just what difference that might make. So those are the 4 ways of cultivating empathy: making the imaginative leap, empathic listening, developing curiosity about strangers, supporting mass empathic movements. But let me leave you with a final thought of the importance of balancing introspection with outrospection. We traditionally think that, if you think about someone like Socrates. Socrates said, the best way to live a wise and good life is to know thyself, right? Which is about looking inside yourself. And this was the great message of the 20th century. From Sigmund Freud to Oprah Winfrey, they said, to understand who you are, how to live, search your soul. Now, of course, I think that kind of soul-searching and self-reflection is absolutely vital. But I think the pendulum has swung too far, too much towards introspection, and we need to develop what I call outrospection, which is the idea of discovering who you are and how to live by stepping outside yourself and discovering the lives of other people and other civilizations. And I believe that empathy is the ultimate art form for creating a new age of outrospection. And it makes sense to cultivate empathy. It's part of who we are. The great Dutch primatologist Frans de Waal says that we are homo empathicus. We are wired for empathy. It's part of our evolutionary history. So I think we should be nurturing our empathic selves, which live alongside our selfish inner drives. And we should also be joining to create a new revolution of human relationships in the 21st century. And if we all focus on cultivating our empathy, I believe we can move from an old philosophical era of I think, therefore I am, to a new era of you are, therefore I am. Thank you very much.
Human.